The storm had come fast over the high desert, rolling down from the red mesas like an army of gray ghosts. By dusk, the wind screamed through the canyon, shaking the cottonwoods along the dry creek. Sarah Whitmore clutched her shawl tighter as she urged her mule through the rain. She'd left the mining camp at dawn, thinking she could reach the fort before nightfall. But the plains had a way of swallowing time, and now she was lost somewhere between God's mercy and the devil's joke. Her bonnet clung to her wet hair, the ribbons snapping in the wind, and every breath came out in clouds that vanished as quickly as her courage. Somewhere out in the darkness, she thought she heard a horse. At first, she told herself it was thunder, but the sound came again, steady, rhythmic, alive. She froze. Out there, men rode for many reasons, and most of them weren't kind to a woman traveling alone. She'd run from men before: a drunk husband who sold her ring for whiskey, a foreman who thought hunger made her cheap. But the figure that came out of the storm was nothing like the men she feared. He rode bareback, straight and tall, wrapped in a dark blanket that shimmered with rain. The lightning lit his face, sharp as carved stone, eyes the color of the earth after rain. An Apache. Her first instinct was to flee. Every tale she'd ever heard about Apaches was painted in blood: ambushes, raids, and fires that left no survivors. But there was no fear in the man's posture, only calm, and in his eyes something she hadn't seen in years: quiet understanding. When he lifted a hand, palm open, she almost sobbed with relief. "You ride wrong way," he said, voice deep and calm, broken but clear. "The river is up. You fall, you die." His English was rough, but his meaning plain. Sarah swallowed, trying to find words through the cold. My mule's tired. I didn't mean to trespass," she said, her voice trembling more from exhaustion than fear. The Apache studied her for a long moment, then pointed toward the shadowed ridge behind him. "Come," he said. "You freeze out here." It wasn't a question. For a moment she hesitated, glancing back toward the invisible road to the fort. Every rule she'd ever been taught screamed not to trust him. But her body was shaking too hard to think, and there was something in his tone. Firm, gentle, like a promise that didn't need words. She nodded. The man turned his horse and rode slowly ahead, letting her follow. The storm swallowed them both. The climb to the ridge felt endless. Lightning flared across the sky, showing glimpses of twisted junipers and rock walls slick with rain. The Apache didn't look back often, but when he did, she saw his eyes glint like firelight, watchful, protective. When they reached the top, she saw a small lodge built of cedar poles and hides, half hidden beneath a bluff. Smoke curled weakly from a hole in the roof. He dismounted and tied his horse to a post, then turned to her. "Inside," he said simply. Sarah stepped into the lodge, half expecting the place to be bare, but the inside was warm, alive with the scent of sage and smoke. Furs lined the ground. A fire burned low in the pit, its light catching the patterns painted on the hide walls. The warmth hit her like a wave, and for the first time that night her hand stopped shaking. The Apache crouched beside the fire, added a few pieces of wood, and motioned for her to sit. She obeyed, too tired to argue. For a long while neither spoke. Rain drummed on the roof and thunder rolled far away, but inside it felt as though the world had paused to breathe. The man glanced at her again. "You come far," he said finally. "Where you go?" She hesitated. There were things she'd rather keep buried, like the bruises that had just begun to fade beneath her collar, or the letter in her bag promising work that might not exist. "Fort Stanton," she said softly. "They said they need help, teacher or cook, I don't care which." He nodded slowly. "White men's fort. Long ride yet. Bad storm. You stay till morning." The way he said it, simple, certain, made her heart twist. No one had spoken to her like that in years. Not since before the war, before loss had become her shadow. She studied him more closely, the strong lines of his face, the quiet strength in his hands as he stirred the fire. There was something wounded behind his stillness, a silence that came from more than solitude. She wondered if he'd lost someone too. When she tried to thank him, her voice cracked. He looked up sharply, as if her gratitude embarrassed him. "No thanks," he said. "Storm helped no one." Then after a pause, his tone softened. "You cold? Dry things there." He pointed toward a folded blanket and a hide robe near the back of the lodge. She turned her face away as he stepped outside to tend to his horse, grateful for the moment of privacy. She changed slowly, wrapping herself in the robe. The fur was warm and smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. When she looked up, she noticed something near the fire, a small carving of a woman's face worn smooth by time. Not white, not Apache, something between. She traced its features lightly. When he came back in, wet hair clinging to his shoulders, she asked, "Your wife?" He paused, then shook his head. "Was," he said quietly. The word carried the weight of a whole story. She lowered her eyes, feeling she'd stepped on sacred ground. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He only nodded, then sat across from her. The firelight made his skin glow bronze, his gaze steady. "Storm ends soon," he said after a while. "You sleep. Morning come fast." Sarah tried to rest, but sleep came in fragments. Outside, the wind howled like something ancient and wild, and each gust made the fire flicker. Once she thought she heard him humming softly, a tune low and mournful, something between a prayer and a memory. It lulled her in ways she didn't expect. When her eyes finally closed, she felt the strange safety of knowing that somewhere in the dark, he was watching over her, not as captor or stranger, but as something far gentler, and though she didn't know it yet, that night on the ridge would change the course of both their lives, the beginning of something neither had dared hope for again. The first light of morning seeped through the gaps in the cedar walls, brushing the lodge in soft gold that made the smoke curling from the hearth look like mist suspended in air. Sarah stirred beneath the fur robe, feeling the lingering warmth of the fire and the quiet presence of the Apache nearby. He was still awake, sitting cross-legged by the pit, tending the dying embers with careful patience. His hands moved with deliberate calm, and the subtle way he glanced at her from the corner of his eyes made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't boldness or rough desire, but a tender awareness that made the space between them charged with unspoken meaning. She wanted to speak, to thank him again, but the words lodged in her throat. Instead, she studied him, the way his shoulders relaxed when he thought no one was looking, the way the firelight traced the lines of his face, and how even in silence he seemed to radiate a quiet authority. Something in the curve of his jaw and the strength in his hands hinted at a life filled with trials, yet his presence exuded safety. Her pulse quickened at the thought that for one night, this stranger, this warrior of the mesas, had sheltered her without question, without demand, without expectation. He finally shifted, his movements deliberate but not intrusive, and stretched his back before standing. The floorboards creaked softly under his weight, and she felt herself drawn into the rhythm of his presence. He offered her a small smile, subtle but unmistakable, and she realized it wasn't just his physical proximity that affected her. It was the way he carried himself, calm yet aware, a living contradiction of strength and gentleness. Her eyes met his and the moment stretched, taut with quiet curiosity. Neither spoke, but she sensed that he knew she was awake, that he was aware of her watching him as he moved about the lodge. Breaking the silence, he spoke softly. "Storm pass. River calm now. Sky clear soon." His voice, low and steady, wrapped around her like the first warmth of sun on chilled skin. Sarah wanted to respond, wanted to find words that could bridge the distance of their worlds, yet all she managed was a nod. The subtle connection, the brush of eyes, the shared understanding was enough to stir something inside her, a delicate thrill that seemed to rise from her chest to her fingers and toes. She could feel her pulse echoing in the lodge, mingling with the low crackle of the fire. Eventually, he moved to the door, pulling it open to let the morning air drift in. Mist clung to the mesas beyond, rolling down in ghostly waves, and the storm's aftermath made the desert shimmer with wet earth and silver light. He gestured for her to follow. Sarah hesitated, momentarily overwhelmed by both the beauty of the world and the intimacy of the silent invitation. Her robe wrapped tightly around her, she stepped toward him, and the moment their hands brushed, a shiver ran through her. Not of cold, but of the unspoken magnetism between them. Outside, the desert was alive in a way she had never noticed before. Drops of rain clung to sagebrush and juniper needles, sparkling in the newborn sun. The Apache walked ahead with measured steps, his blanket falling around him like a shadow, but he frequently looked back, checking on her. Their eyes met often enough that words became unnecessary. Sarah noticed the way he moved. Deliberate, thoughtful, a combination of power and ease. The air between them seemed charged, not with fear or expectation, but with awareness of one another. Like two spirits circling cautiously yet inexorably. He led her to where his horse had been tied, now shaking off rain and steam rising from its wet coat. His hands worked deftly, brushing the animal with care, and she realized it wasn't just the horse he handled with tenderness, but everything around him, the fire, the lodge, the land itself. Watching him, she felt an unnameable stirring, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and the faint thrill of something forbidden yet inevitable. Every glance they shared was a conversation. Every subtle movement a sentence neither needed to speak aloud. As the sun climbed, the mist began to lift, revealing the rolling mesas, the burnt orange cliffs, and the soft green valleys stretching to the horizon. The Apache gestured for her to follow a narrow path toward a spring where the water pooled in crystal clarity. Sarah's heart pounded as she walked beside him. The proximity, the quiet rhythm of shared footsteps, and the soft murmur of the wind through the rocks made the world shrink to only the two of them. Each moment seemed elongated, as if time itself recognized the fragile magic building between them. She dared a glance at him, noticing the fine details she had missed in the dim lodge. The curve of his brow, the intensity in his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw that spoke of both restraint and an inner fire. Her chest tightened as though her heart knew something she had yet to articulate, a sense that in him, she had found a presence capable of quiet devotion and fierce protection. The way he walked, the way he moved through the desert with instinctive grace, left her breathless in a way that had nothing to do with the climb or the chill. Finally, they reached the spring. The Apache knelt by the water, cupping it in his hands, and Sarah mirrored him instinctively. Their eyes met over the glassy surface, and she felt a pulse between them, a silent acknowledgement that they were both aware of the subtle thread connecting them. She laughed softly at the absurdity of her own boldness, and he allowed himself a brief smile, a flash of warmth that seemed to ignite the air around them. Neither spoke, yet the tension was tangible, like a violin string stretched to its limit, quivering with promise. For the first time since the storm had begun, Sarah felt the weight of fear lift. The desert, the storm, the uncertainties, all seemed distant when measured against the strange, tender gravity of his presence. She realized she was beginning to trust him, not in the naive sense of blind faith, but in the quiet understanding that some people, some moments, could be anchors in a world that had too often been unkind. And in that trust, in that shared silence beneath the pale morning sun, a subtle warmth blossomed, romantic, electric, and entirely new, one that neither words nor gestures could fully contain. By the time they turned back toward the lodge, the sun had climbed higher, burning away the final wisps of mist. The Apache walked just ahead, giving her a small margin of space, yet she felt every step they shared as if it were a conversation of bodies, eyes, and spirits. And though no promises had been spoken, Sarah sensed a fragile bond forming, delicate yet undeniable, carrying the weight of possibility. A single shared glance, a brush of hands, a smile held too long. The world seemed to pause around them, honoring the slow, inevitable pull of two hearts discovering each other amidst the vast, wild beauty of the desert. It was the kind of tension that did not require confession, yet its presence was undeniable, the kind that could ignite a lifetime of trust, care, and love if nurtured. And in the way the Apache walked, the way he glanced back, and the way Sarah followed him willingly into the new day, there was a quiet promise that the storm had not just passed. They had emerged into a space where hope, connection, and the first stirrings of something profound awaited. The morning stretched lazily over the mesa, the sun climbing higher and spilling gold across the desert floor. Sarah and the Apache had returned to the lodge, their clothes damp from the mist yet warmed by the fire that he had rekindled. Silence lingered between them at first, comfortable and unforced, a companionable pause that seemed to acknowledge the fragile trust forming in those quiet hours. Sarah watched him, noticing the way his fingers flexed as he rearranged the firewood, the way the sun traced patterns across his face, highlighting the strength in his jaw and the gentleness in his eyes. Each glance felt like a question, a tentative probe into the depths of understanding and curiosity they shared. And she realized that in him, she was allowed to feel both bold and safe. He noticed her gaze but did not flinch or turn away. Instead, he moved with measured grace, letting her observe him as if her attention were a gentle offering rather than a burden. There was a rhythm in his movements that was almost hypnotic, a natural ease that made the air around him feel warmer, more alive. Sarah felt a stirring in her chest she hadn't experienced in years, a mixture of longing, admiration, and the quiet thrill of being seen without judgment. She wanted to speak, to break the silence with words that might reveal the depth of her gratitude and fascination, but she was cautious. Words could be clumsy. Actions, she realized, had a certain honesty that conversation could not always capture. Finally, he turned, and for a brief instant, their eyes locked with an intensity that made her stomach twist in anticipation. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice low, steady, carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around her like the fur robe she still wore. It was not a question in the casual sense. It was an invitation, an acknowledgement that they could share this moment together without pretense. Sarah nodded, finding herself oddly shy despite the growing comfort she felt in his presence. He moved to a small storage area, returning with a bundle of cornmeal and dried herbs, beginning to prepare a simple breakfast over the fire. She watched him work, captivated by the effortless care with which he measured, mixed, and tended to the cooking. As the aroma of the meal filled the lodge, Sarah found herself drawn closer, sitting near enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. Every motion he made seemed deliberate yet effortless, each gesture a testament to the years of skill and knowledge honed in harmony with the land. She was aware of the tension in her own body, a quiet, anticipatory energy that neither of them addressed directly, but that pulsed between them nonetheless. She reached out almost unconsciously to adjust a log in the fire, their hands brushing for the briefest moment. The contact was electric yet gentle, an acknowledgement of the growing intimacy and mutual respect that had begun to root itself in the space they now shared. Conversation slowly unfurled, tentative and careful, as he began to speak of the land, the mesas, the rivers, the storms that came unbidden and left beauty in their wake. His words were measured, deliberate, carrying both knowledge and reverence. Sarah listened, enthralled not only by the stories but by the quiet reverence in his voice. When she spoke of her own life, her words came haltingly at first, revealing little but enough for him to sense her resilience and the hardships she had endured. She told him of the camp, the work she hoped to find, the fleeting sense of freedom that came from moving across the plains despite the storms. He listened without interruption, his gaze unwavering, allowing her the space to speak and, more importantly, to be heard. As the meal finished, he gestured toward the door. "Walk," he said simply, and she understood. They moved out into the morning light, the lodge now behind them, leaving the smell of smoke and sage in their wake. The desert stretched endlessly, bathed in soft gold, mist retreating slowly from the jagged cliffs and rolling valleys. Each step beside him felt like a shared secret, a conversation of proximity and presence that spoke louder than any words could. Sarah noticed the subtle movements he made, how he shifted his weight, how he scanned the horizon, how he occasionally glanced back at her with eyes that were both protective and inviting. At a small outcropping overlooking a spring-fed pool, they paused. The Apache knelt to drink, and she followed instinctively, mirroring his movements. Their eyes met over the water's surface, and in that reflection, Sarah saw not only the contours of his face but the depth of his gaze, the quiet fire behind his calm exterior. She felt a shiver of recognition, as though the world had contracted to only the two of them, and in that shared silence, something delicate and precious had begun to bloom. Neither needed to speak, yet the connection deepened, a subtle acknowledgement that both understood the significance of this fragile bond forming between them. Time seemed to stretch, the morning sun climbing higher as they explored the ridge together, moving in a rhythm that was both natural and intimate. He showed her small details of the landscape, the way certain rocks caught the light, how the air smelled different after rain, the hidden paths animals took. She laughed softly at the beauty of it, and he allowed himself a smile in return, subtle but full of warmth. Every gesture, every shared glance seemed imbued with meaning, reinforcing the silent understanding that had begun to grow in their hearts. By mid-morning, the heat of the sun was tempered by a soft breeze, and the bond between them had grown stronger yet delicate, like a fragile sapling bending toward the light. Sarah realized she felt a sense of anticipation she had not known in years, the kind that came from being truly seen and respected, from a presence that invited trust and care rather than demanding it. The Apache, in turn, seemed aware of the quiet pull she felt, responding with subtle movements, brief touches, and the calm steadiness of someone who understood the power of patience and restraint. As they returned to the lodge, carrying water and firewood, Sarah felt a warmth that had little to do with the sun. The air between them was charged with the quiet tension of two hearts slowly discovering each other. The shared moments, the glances, the touches, the unspoken understanding, had created an intimacy that was both exhilarating and comforting. It was a delicate dance of attraction and trust, the kind that promised something enduring if nurtured with patience and care. And in the way he moved beside her, guiding yet giving space, and the way she responded with subtle attention and openness, a fragile, hopeful connection had begun to take root, one that neither could deny and that both sensed would grow into something lasting, something beautiful, and something deeply transformative. The afternoon sun hung high over the mesas, casting long golden shadows across the desert floor. Sarah and the Apache had returned from their walk along the ridge, each step carrying them deeper into a rhythm that was uniquely theirs. The lodge, small and humble as it was, had become a sanctuary, a place where the world's chaos, storms, and cruelties felt suspended outside. Inside, the fire crackled softly, sending tendrils of smoke curling toward the ceiling, and every detail of the space seemed charged with the memory of their shared morning. She noticed the subtle ways he moved around the lodge, the quiet reverence with which he handled the wood, the careful way he arranged the furs, even the way his gaze lingered on her, not with impatience or expectation, but with attention that was intimate in its gentleness. Sarah's heart thrummed in a rhythm she had not known in years, a mix of anticipation, admiration, and something almost sacred. She felt the warmth radiating from him as he knelt to adjust the fire, the way his muscles shifted under the folds of his blanket, and the soft exhale he gave when the embers flared to life. Every gesture, however small, spoke of a life lived close to the land, close to understanding, close to quiet strength. And yet it was not brute strength that made her pulse quicken. It was the subtle intimacy of presence, the shared silences, the invisible tether that had grown between them since that first night of storm and shadow. She found herself drawn closer, not with impatience but with a magnetic curiosity she could neither name nor resist. He noticed her watching him but did not comment, did not break the spell with words. Instead, he offered her small signs of inclusion, sliding a bundle of herbs across the floor for her to touch, demonstrating the ritual of preparing a simple meal with patience and care. Every glance they shared seemed to carry a weight of meaning, and Sarah realized that the quiet gestures, hands brushing against one another while passing a log, the accidental touch as they both reached for the same bundle of herbs, were becoming conversations in themselves. She felt a shiver run through her, not from cold but from the charged intimacy of those moments, and she marveled at how something so simple could feel so profound. At length, he gestured toward the doorway. "Walk," he said again, and she understood it not as a command but as an invitation, a silent promise that the bond between them could deepen further. The desert outside had transformed since the morning. The storm's remnants were now distant clouds, and the sunlight reflected off wet rock and sagebrush in brilliant clarity. Each step along the trail beside him was a careful negotiation of closeness and respect, a dance neither had rehearsed but both seemed to instinctively understand. The way he occasionally glanced back, the subtle tilt of his head, the rhythm of his stride, all of it communicated awareness, patience, and a growing recognition of mutual attraction. By the time they reached a shallow canyon that funneled the wind in gentle gusts, Sarah felt an almost dizzying mixture of exhilaration and nervous anticipation. The Apache stopped at the edge of a rock outcrop and gestured for her to sit. "Here," he said simply. She obeyed, heart beating faster than she had anticipated, and he crouched beside her. For several moments they simply looked at the desert below, the horizon stretching infinitely, the world reduced to sand, sky, and the rhythmic sound of their breathing. It was a silence that neither needed to fill, a silence that spoke volumes about the trust that had begun to root between them. Eventually she dared a question, her voice soft. "Did you do this often?" Her words were clumsy, betraying both curiosity and the tentative vulnerability she felt. He turned to her, eyes steady and kind. "Walk the mesas," he said. "Think, be quiet. Life is loud." There was a weight behind his words, a history hinted at but never fully revealed, and it stirred something in Sarah. She felt the first real pull of empathy, not pity, but connection to the quiet depth of his experiences, the resilience etched into his very being. She realized that the attraction she felt was not merely physical or fleeting. It was rooted in understanding, in shared awareness, in the recognition of strength and gentleness coexisting in a single soul. The wind shifted, brushing against her face, and she felt the warmth of his presence beside her. Their shoulders brushed lightly, almost imperceptibly, yet the contact sent a shiver through her. He did not move away. He did not force closeness, but the space between them seemed charged, as though the desert itself conspired to draw them together without haste. In that quiet proximity, she sensed the unspoken conversation that had been building since the storm. Recognition, interest, mutual respect, and the delicate threads of desire woven carefully into the fabric of trust. He reached into his blanket and drew out a small piece of carved wood, smooth and worn from handling. It was a carving of a hawk, wings spread as if caught mid-flight. He handed it to her. Sarah took it with trembling hands, aware that this was more than a simple gift. It was a piece of himself, a fragment of his life shared willingly, a symbol of trust. She studied the carving, tracing the lines with her fingers, and felt an odd sense of wonder. "It's beautiful," she whispered, not just of the hawk, but of him, of the gesture, of the moment suspended between them. He nodded, a subtle smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Hawk sees far, knows we're safe," he said. His eyes held hers, steady and unflinching, and Sarah felt the full force of the quiet intimacy that had been building since the stormy night. It was a connection that did not demand confession, did not require immediate acknowledgement, yet its presence was undeniable. Every glance, every gesture, every shared breath seemed infused with the unspoken promise of something enduring, something tender, and something profoundly human. As the sun began to dip toward the western cliffs, painting the desert in hues of amber and rose, they rose together, walking back to the lodge. The world seemed softer, quieter, the air heavy with the scent of earth and sage. Sarah realized that she no longer felt the fear and isolation that had plagued her journey. In its place was a growing awareness of trust, a delicate excitement of affection, and the subtle thrill of a bond that had begun to bloom between them. A bond that promised warmth, safety, and the possibility of love. That evening, as they returned to the lodge, Sarah caught herself watching him, not with caution, not with hesitation, but with curiosity and admiration. The bond between them had strengthened, the tension had grown, and the spark of romance that had begun in the storm now shone with quiet brilliance. The night promised the continuation of their shared journey, a journey built on trust, understanding, and the unspoken acknowledgement that neither of them had known they had been waiting for this kind of connection. Gentle, fierce, patient, and alive with hope. The evening had deepened into a gentle twilight, the sun slipping behind the mesas and spilling streaks of rose and amber across the desert horizon. The lodge was quiet now, the fire casting a soft, flickering glow across the cedar walls and furs on the floor. Sarah and the Apache sat near the hearth, their shoulders almost touching, the air between them rich with unspoken understanding. Neither felt the need to fill the silence with words. They had come to recognize that presence, careful attention, and quiet companionship were often more meaningful than conversation. The storm had passed long ago, leaving behind a landscape washed clean, and in many ways, it had also washed away the barriers each of them had carried for so long. Sarah traced the patterns of the carvings and furs around the lodge, her fingers lingering on the textures, and for a moment she felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by the steady, grounding presence beside her. He watched her quietly, allowing her the space to adjust, to breathe, to inhabit this moment fully. The tension that had begun in the stormy night, the quiet stirrings of attraction, and the fragile bond forged through shared vulnerability had grown into something palpable, warm, safe, and exhilarating all at once. She felt a swell of gratitude that was deeper than words, a gratitude for his protection, his patience, his gentle strength. And more than anything, she felt a yearning she had thought long buried, the yearning to trust, to hope, to embrace the possibility of love again. He shifted slightly, breaking the stillness, and offered her a small smile, subtle yet full of meaning. "You strong," he said, voice low, almost reverent. Sarah's breath caught, not at the words themselves, but at the sincerity that lingered behind them. She realized he had seen her fully, and that he respected her strength as much as he protected her vulnerability. In that acknowledgement, she felt the unspoken bond deepen further. She nodded in quiet affirmation, unable to find words that could carry the weight of her emotions. And yet, in the simple exchange of glances, the soft curve of a smile, the steady presence beside her, there was an understanding that needed no elaboration. They were no longer alone, each anchored by the other's quiet, enduring strength. As darkness settled outside, the lodge became a cocoon of warmth and intimacy. The Apache tended the fire while Sarah arranged some of the furs and blankets, small acts that were both practical and symbolic, a rhythm that created space for connection without forcing it. Each movement, each glance, each shared breath seemed to communicate layers of trust and tenderness that neither could have expressed in words. The quiet intimacy was comforting, exhilarating, and transformative all at once. Sarah felt the stirrings of a bond that could sustain her through the challenges of the world beyond the lodge walls, and he too seemed subtly changed, softened by her presence, his stoic strength tempered by the fragile vulnerability she inspired in him. Eventually, the night deepened into a serene quiet, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional call of distant wildlife. Sarah shifted closer, allowing herself to feel the steady warmth radiating from him. The quiet pulse of his presence as reassuring as it was electrifying. He made no move to close the space forcibly. Yet the shared proximity was charged with an intimacy neither could ignore. She felt the power of this connection, not in physical terms alone, but in the sense of shared humanity, mutual respect, and the gentle thrill of attraction tempered by trust. Each glance, each brush of hands, each subtle movement reinforced the growing certainty that they were both discovering something rare, something worth nurturing, something lasting. When he finally spoke again, it was in that same low, deliberate tone that had drawn her to him from the first night. "Storm pass," he said softly. "New day comes." The simplicity of the statement belied its depth, and Sarah realized it was as much about their shared experience as it was about the weather. The storm had indeed passed, not just the literal storm that had brought her to his lodge, but the storms of isolation, fear, and mistrust they had carried for so long. And now, in the wake of both the tempest and their careful navigation of shared vulnerability, a new day, a new chapter, stretched before them, bright, uncharted, and full of promise. They remained near the fire long into the night, the bond between them solidifying with each passing hour. Words became unnecessary. Gestures, glances, and quiet companionship spoke volumes. Every smile, every tilt of the head, every shared laugh carried a resonance that neither had experienced in years. And in those moments, the world beyond the lodge, harsh, unpredictable, and often unkind, seemed to fade, leaving only the sanctuary they had built together. In each other's presence, they discovered strength, warmth, and a profound sense of belonging that promised a future brighter than either had dared imagine alone. As dawn approached again, spilling soft light over the desert cliffs and mesas, Sarah felt a deep, quiet certainty that she had found her place, not just in the world, but with this man whose strength and gentleness had become a mirror for her own courage and resilience. And he too seemed to carry the same realization, that in opening himself to trust, to tenderness, and to the possibility of shared life, he had found a companion whose presence enriched every moment. Together they faced the desert morning not as strangers or survivors of storms, but as partners embarking on a journey of hope, connection, and love. In the quiet that followed, with the fire dying to embers and the first birds beginning their morning songs, Sarah allowed herself to close her eyes, resting her hand lightly near his. He did not move away. Instead, he offered a subtle squeeze of reassurance, a silent vow that the bond they had forged was real and enduring. Outside, the wind whispered through the mesas, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and sage. And in that perfect, fleeting stillness, Sarah and the Apache both knew that they had emerged from the storm not merely unscathed, but transformed, drawn together by circumstance, strengthened by trust and bound by a tender, hopeful love that promised a future as wide and infinite as the desert sky. It was a beginning, a first chapter written not in words alone, but in shared presence, quiet courage, and the gentle understanding that sometimes the fiercest storms give way to the most enduring love. And in that lodge, on that mesa, beneath the vast Old West sky, two hearts that had wandered through fear and solitude finally found one another, safe, cherished, and ready to face whatever days and storms might come next.